Greetings, Dr. Joseph Martin. Buckminster Fuller, or Bucky as he likes to be called, Utopia or Oblivion. Now, Buckminster Fuller was a neo-futurist, a humanist. He was an inventor, an architect, and also a designer and an author with 28 books that he wrote over his lifetime. He was born in America in the state of Maine on July the 12th, 1895, and he passed back into spirit on July the 1st in 1983 at the age of 88 years of age. And he's quite a character who will be known for many centuries to come, and I had the good fortune and blessing to actually have met and studied with Bucky Fuller from 1966 to 1969, but more of that in a wee little bit. Now, Bucky Fuller was born as in a family, a sort of a well-known family, had a Transcendentalist kind of background from that movement within America in the 19th century. Some of his relatives were in that movement and started the movement. He also grew up as a Unitarian, as a Universalist in his early years, and spent a lot of his free time as a young boy and teenager on Bear Island in Penobscot Bay, in just off the state of Maine. He also happened to get a mill technician's certificate and did a lot of work in his early years in Canada in different mills and textile mills, in fact. He's a well-known inventor. As many of you might know, the geodesic dome is actually his invention, and it was used in 1967 at the Montreal Expo, the centenary of the, shall we say, the birth of Canada. In the dome that was there, the biomechanical geodesic dome that was there in Montreal Expo, and I actually happened to be inside it there as I was playing in our high school band inside the dome. Very interesting experience. I remember the first time I met Bucky Fuller. It was Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario in 1966, early in the spring. And the first thing I remember in the auditorium there was that there were no chairs and there was only a table in the middle of a very bare kind of a platform or stage. And on this table, a very plain table, he sat there cross-legged and now and then would just lie on his right side, kind of like the Buddha in his perinirvana state. And he spoke from there, sitting or lying on the table. Bucky Fuller was an amazing man. He's the one who designed the Dymaxion house, which looked like a grain silo in which everything was sustainable and recycled. He was the first person to use gray water, and everything was sustainable within the house, including the use of sun and wind and solar energy. It wasn't necessarily designed to fit into the space around it, the bioregional space, but it was useful and still could be in those humid and windy areas of the planet. He also developed the Dymaxion car, a three-wheeled car that did use gas, and it could carry 11 people inside, go up to 90 miles an hour, and was very functional and streamlined in its shape on the outside of the vehicle. Dymaxion is the word that he coined, which means dynamic maximum tension. So he had Dymaxion houses, cars, and of course geodesic dome, which had dynamic maximum tension in its structure and could hold itself up. But one of the most important things about Bucky Fuller that I want to share, because we always want to share about the personal life of someone, not necessarily all that they brought to the humanity. In 1927, when he was 32 years of age, he had lost his business that he'd started with his father-in-law. They had no money. It was a time, of course, during the Depression. He was living in Chicago at the time. He had lost his first daughter to polio at the age of 4, and that really upset him deeply. His next daughter was just about to be born. And he was deeply depressed, was drinking heavily, and he decided to commit suicide. Now, I've heard this story from Bucky several times in person, so I can attest to the veracity of this. He said he walked to the end of a dock in on the shore of Lake Michigan, and he decided to end it all because he was extremely depressed. He jumped into the water and suddenly realized when he was in the water two things. He remembered he couldn't swim at all, and yet somehow, seemingly miraculously, he was floating. And for some strange reason, or maybe not a spiritual reason, he was able to somewhat dog paddle or be drifted back to shore and climb out. During this near death experience he had, he said the following, and I'm going to read it to you. These are his actual quotes from his um, Dymaxion chronicles of his life, which he wrote voraciously, and it's now at one of the universities in America. He thought that if he would keep a record of everything from his life, that it would be useful for people centuries to come. In any case, at this time when he was committing suicide and had a near-death experience, he felt himself floating off the ground in a bubble of white light. And here's what he said. From now, he heard the voice actually inside him, and it was a voice, but he confirmed that it was a voice from the universe. From now on, you need never await temporal attestation to your thought. You think the truth. You do not have the right to eliminate yourself. You do not belong to you. You belong to the universe. Your significance will remain forever obscure to you, but you may assume that you are fulfilling your role if you apply yourself to converting your experiences to the highest advantage of others. And then he also wrote, that I ultimately chose to embark on an experiment to find what a single individual can contribute to changing the world and benefiting all humanity. And this destination for himself, this personal journey, was one where he said he wouldn't accept money from others, he wouldn't accept any training except the knowledge that he had inside himself from the universe, as he calls it, and that he would always do his best and give back to humanity and invent the things that would be useful to all people for all times. And so we know that he was one of the very first ecologists or environmentalists to use only sustainable, renewable resources, basically solar energy and wind power as well. He incorporated a number of terms that we use today. One is tensegrity or tensional integrity, which is both a structural term in terms of the things that occur in nature and what to build and the structural materials to use, but it's a term that was even taken up by Carlos Castaneda in his studies with Don Juan. Tensegrity is a psychological, inner, energetic, structural unity that you can do using your mind and your emotions and your body and movements of your mind and movements of your physical arms and legs. Tensegrity then is from the last book of Carlos Castaneda. He liked to say that our orientation in the third dimensional space is not about what's up and down, rather it's what's inside yourself and what's outside yourself. So he would say you're going instairs or you're going outstairs. And he also said that we need to accept the fact that everything is three-dimensional, fourth-dimensional, spherical in the universe. All the stars, all the moons, all the suns. Our own energy field is always spherical. And so he said, since we now know it's not a flat Earth, it's a round Earth, we need to call it world around. And that was his term for the global community that is developing. The Spaceship Earth was one of his notions, and he said that we have to see ourselves as one sphere on planet Earth. It's a watery planet, in conjunction and unity with, of course, the sun, our moon, all the other planets of our solar system, and indeed all the stars of the universe. And we need to consciously acknowledge that wisdom and abide by it in all the things we do moving forward here as one global community. global village. Now, that 32-year-old young man had an epiphany, a transcendental experience where his true higher self or soul nature came through from the source of the universe and spoke to him very clearly in definite words. Thereafter, he never considered himself to be a noun or an object, which most of the people on the planet consider themselves to be just objectified nouns or objects, but he seemed to sense himself as being a verb. In fact, he has a great book that you would love, I Seem to Be a Verb, meaning that we're all individuals in a unified connection in the universe in an evolutionary process of transformation. And that's the key. He was always growing, always changing, always sharing, always opening up and doing the best for all of humanity, for those who were alive during his years and for those who came after. He is definitely considered to be one of the greatest futurists and inventors and a worldwide knowledge base, and is definitely worth looking at some of his books. For instance, the one that's still available and still in print now is Critical Path, Buckminster Fuller. There you have a vision of his geodesic dome there in 2 dimensions. In this book, which I highly recommend, I keep rereading it and I have for about 40 years now, you can see that, first of all, he gives you the scientific historical record of all the discoveries and actual elements in the periodic table for the last 6,000 years, since 4000 BC, in the beginning of the agrarian revolution, all the way up, most particularly in the last 500 years, in the Industrial Revolution and the time of the great emancipation of consciousness in the Italian Renaissance and the European Renaissance, spiritually and scientifically as well. And along with all these discoveries there's many pages, you'll want to read them all, the discovery of all the elements. There's one named after him, fullerene, which is a carbon compound which actually looks like a geodesic dome under a microscope. But we also have there all the major events from 1895 all the way up to the present time when he passed in 1983. In this book, Critical Path, actually, what you might find most interesting is an historical analysis of the socioeconomic systems of the world. And based on the notion that we are all marine-based societies, as we grew from Greece and Rome and China and Japan and all of the colonizing European nations, that the basis of the navies of the world, and he was in the First World War in the Navy, he was a radio operator, so he knew firsthand and had traveled all the 7 oceans. He understood that the future will always be based on marine flotation and transportation, as well as things in the air. Like Leonardo, he was one of those brilliant inventors. And you find the history of the politics and socioeconomics, the colonial system, the takeover of the world's economic systems by what he calls the law caps, or those lawyers who were involved mostly in America at the turn of the 1900s and into the First and Second World Wars, who took over all the corporatization of the world, the global hegemony of the economic system, the politics, the farms, the industrialization, and all the Second and Third World by what he called the law caps, or the lawyers who worked for the corporate world of the banks and so on, the major corporations of the world. A very interesting and pertinent analysis of all this, highly recommended, so we understand the socio-economic system now that we have with the 1% elite. He was definitely one of the very first people to speak about this in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Now, there's so much we can say about Bucky Fuller. He's obviously a colorful character. There are many things that I could share in stories about him, but I'd just like to share some things about him, maybe the principles of the universe that came through at the age of 32 when he had his epiphany, his transcendental kind of reawakening and rebirth. Ephemeralization is something where we can say that it's doing more with less, and that also meant the material use of the things in the world, the structural elements in buildings, so to use less materials in what you build, and that ephemeralization is the first principle that he talks about. Synergetics is his notion of using the general systems theory, which was prominent in the time of the mid-20th century, to show how everything is interconnected, and if you use dynamic maximum tension in your thinking and in your structures and the functions of buildings, for instance, or whatever it is that you're creating, including art and architecture, that you will find that everything is interrelated and you can create the most dynamic tension with less materials and also the structure of how you build. And the other thing, the third systemic or principle of the universe, he says, would be sustainability. And Bucky Fuller would have been one of the very first to use that word, which is so common these days. Sustainability means using all the renewable resources available to us on Spaceship Earth that mostly, of course, from the solar power, the solar energy, that would be the major one, and then also the wind power that we can use. And now, the title of this is Utopia or Oblivion. We're all aware of the fact that we're in a very major crisis point, a tipping point, a turning point right now, with so many decisions available. You know, there are so many nuclear warheads now in so many nations. So many nations are falling apart into various kind of competing, warring ethnic groups, whether it's the Middle East or in almost every country of the world now. Bucky Fuller, in the 1970s, he said that was an amazing decade. He has an historical analysis decade by decade. He said we had brought into our consciousness as a collective world around global village that all the knowledge and wisdom we needed was now available to us in the 1970s. The question is whether we would just avoid university and college. He was twice expelled from Harvard for carousing and having too much fun, and he just didn't fit in because he had wanted to find the knowledge that fit and not the corporatization information that would be useless to him. And so he said, now we need to apply all this knowledge that we all have in the 1970s, and that was technological knowledge. And of course, he was able to access the fact that the World Wide Web would come in the 1990s, but he wrote about this in the 1940s. So he definitely was a visionary futurist. Since the 1970s, though, there has been a shutdown and the ending of a civilization where the corporatization of politics and universities and the military and nation states has taken over a certain kind of, taken away the freedoms of consciousness and the freedoms of the people in terms of self-determination. And of course, there's always two sides to everything. We know that probably those of you who are in the choir, if you're listening to this, that we do have all the means necessary and the knowledge and wisdom and the courage and the strength and the ability to change the world for the better, to work towards, over many centuries, obviously, a great utopia and a great future, and to avoid the oblivion that is so obviously possible at this time. It all depends on the tipping point of your own heart and consciousness. So that the meaning of this whole gift of Bucky Fuller and what I'm sharing with you now is to acknowledge this and to bless this soul and to share with you the inspiration that Bucky Fuller can still be for you, for all of us at this time. You can read The Critical Path, this great book here. You can go online and there's a lot of information, in fact some YouTubes from Bucky in the 80s, and you can see them all and listen to them as well. I hope this has been useful and inspirational and creative for you. Remember, we're all co-creative inventors here, and maybe you can have or have already had the same experience of numinous metanoia and epiphany, of realizing that you are the universe, and the universe is working through you. When you open up to your true soul nature and get your ego out of the way, or at least in alignment with your soul, you have so much power, so much inventive ability, so much courage and creativity, and the joy is in sharing that, creating it, co-creating it, and giving it back to all humanity at this time, and for centuries to come for all our descendants. Dr. Joseph Martin here. May the wit and the wisdom and the beauty of Bucky be with you always. Om Namah Shivaya.